So thanks enormously for the chance to be here. This conference has always been an enormous thrill, and this year is no different. And thanks to the great number of you in this room who have helped out as I've been writing it, especially Mike Rappaport and Tom Colby, who provoked me to write about this last year at the conference. Briefly, topic boundaries. This paper is about Civil War and Reconstruction history as such. A sequel, one of possibly three sequels, will cover the underlying textual merits, what all these provisions actually meant in 1787, like Article 5 and the congressional and presidential war and insurrection suppression powers in 1811, 1815, and 221. Everybody understands that jargon. Mike says, you're the only one in the world who refers to parts of the Constitution that way. But representation for states in 121 and 131, the preference ban for states in 196, presidential elector selection power for states in 212, and the Republican guarantee of 4-4. For that sequel, I'll set my time machine for 1787 rather than Reconstruction and the Civil War. I'll also canvass end of wartiming law, other denominator law, and linguistics on implicit quantifier limits for terms like each, every, or all. Also, second possible sequel, I don't canvass applications thoroughly here at all. There's a lot of spade work to be done, just identifying possible regional skew. Every time a scholar or a court talks about the 37 states of 1868, figuring out whether that fits the 26 relevant states of 1867. Calabrese and Agudo count up state constitutional provisions, but they look at regional skew, but they have a 15-state South instead of exactly my 10. And finally, a sequel will consider whether any of this is democratic, whatever that means. That's, of course, what Tom and Bruce Ackerman basically focus on. And this is going to blur into a general defense of the originalist Constitution against dead hand objections. Okay, Reconstruction. The legitimacy of the 14th Amendment was hotly debated from 1866, when it was proposed by Congress, until 1872, when the Democratic platform gave up on the issue. Andrew Johnson and the Democrats made two big charges. First, although there was considerable fighting even after Appomattox, by December 1865, the war was over in the sense of armed conflict between well-defined organized groups. But when Congress met, they excluded representatives from defeated Confederate states. That's the 1866 problem. When Congress proposed the 14th Amendment in June 1866, Southern representatives were excluded, and a two-thirds vote of each House would never have been possible if representatives from the former Confederacy were there. Second, ratifications. At the end of the war, the North had 25 states and the Confederacy 11, which meant that to get to 3/4 of the states, or 27 of 36, at least 2 Confederate ratifications would be required, or their lack of ratification explained away, which is what I'll do. Nebraska came into the Union on March 1st, 1867, moving the full denominator goal line to 28 of 37. At one point, that becomes really relevant in explaining away something that Ackerman relies on. So the exact dates are annoyingly important. Okay, now among the former Confederacy, Tennessee ratified immediately in July 1866 and was rewarded with representation in Congress. No other Southern states did so, and several said no that fall. Among the North, 5 states ratified in 1866 and another 14 in January and February 1867. So the tally was 20 of 36 or 20 of 37 after Nebraska came in, way less than 3/4. If, however, we can somehow get the unrepresented South out of the denominator, we have 20 of 26, 3/4, achieved on February 12th, 1867. 18 days later, on March 2nd, 1867, Congress passed the first of the Reconstruction Acts, imposing military government and black suffrage on the South. And this was, of course, before the 15th Amendment, and requiring 14th Amendment ratifications as the price of readmission to Congress. The justification was that these 10 states were rebel states, even in March 1867, lacking legal governments. In the spring and summer of 1868, 7 former Confederate states ratified, which in combination with 3 more Northern ratifications by that time, got the 14th Amendment over the 3/4 threshold in July 1868. Were these 7 pressure ratifications legitimate? That's the 1867 to 1868 problem. My basic answer, and the dominant Republican answer with very few exceptions, my answer is that Congress had the power under 1811 and 1815 to decide that the rebellion had not been adequately suppressed and that forfeiture of Confederates' rights, including Article 5 rights, properly continued until adequate loyalty was established. It was common ground among, I think, all participants in the debate over Reconstruction that Southern rights under the Constitution were suspended during the war. The South was not allowed to leave behind its representatives and senators to undermine the Union's war plans, nor allowed to select presidential electors to vote for McClellan in 1864. Southern Article I and Article II powers were suspended. When Article I gives powers to states, everyone read that to mean implicitly non-rebel states. There was no one during the war, during Reconstruction, as far as I know, who read the text in an unqualified absolute way. Indeed, linguists point out that there are virtually always implicit limits on words like all, or every, or each, or 3/4. The disputes during Reconstruction were instead over A, time, when exactly the Civil War should be deemed to have ended for the purpose of restoring suspended privileges, and B, separation of powers, whether the president or Congress or maybe judges should be able to decide question A, when the war was over. One argument often lodged against Congress's actions involved the 13th Amendment. So if you've seen Lincoln, you know it was pushed through the House and proposed at the end of January 1865. It was then ratified by 19 states of the North, plus 8 states of the former Confederacy, passing the 27 of 36 states goal line in December 1865. These were the same legislatures that were not allowed to send senators to Congress the same month, however. President Johnson and his allies complained repeatedly that it was inconsistent to say that legislatures were legal for Article 5 purposes, but not legal for Article 1 purposes. The Reconstruction Act of 1867 likewise says that the former Confederate rebel states lacked legal governments, which would imperil their 13th Amendment ratifications. It doesn't say that they would imperil the ratifications, but lots of people drew that conclusion. Johnson, his veto message, and lots of others. So what do? Rather than distinguishing Article 1 from Article 5, we should see the full range of Article 5 powers. Article 5 does not actually give states the right to say no in the text of Article 5. It only gives states, A, the power to say yes, and B, the power to be included in the total of which three-fourths yes votes are necessary. My view, and the view of lots of Republicans, beginning long before Reconstruction, is to see the second power, the denominator power, as suspended by the war. Implicit non-rebel states' limits on Article 1 and Article 2 powers should be paired with a non-rebel states' limit on the Article 5 denominator. For the 13th Amendment, that means that the amendment actually became law in June 1865, not December. For the 14th Amendment, that means that it became law in February 1867, before the Reconstruction Acts. The demand for the South to agree to the 14th Amendment was thus like the frequent demand that surrendering Confederates agree to the Emancipation Proclamation. In saying okay to the 14th Amendment, the South was not becoming part of the constitutional author, but agreeing to the Constitution as it then existed. And federal enforcement of current law, of course, is quite a different kettle of fish than federal coercion regarding the authorship of a pending constitutional amendment. Seeing the North as our constitutional author produces some important effects on the law. Brown v. Board of Education, when it discussed the history of segregation in education, was shy about resting its decision on historical grounds, in part because some Southern states excluded blacks from education altogether. However, Northern practice is most important for assessing what a Northern-authored legal principle means, and the history of segregation was very different in the North. In short, we get a somewhat more progressive approach to equality by focusing, as my theory would, on the North. Possible that in certain circumstances it's somewhat less progressive, as as David Upham's evidence, if you apply my theory to that. So there's differences, okay? But I think well, anyway, there's differences. It matters somehow. Second example, incorporation of the Second Amendment. McDonald v. Chicago stressed the fact that 22 of the 37 states in 1868 had state constitutional rights to keep and bear arms. However, among the 26 states represented in Congress in February 1867, when I say the amendment became law, it was a bare majority, 14 to 12. And then Nebraska came in without one, so it was only 14 to 13. Under my view, there was no national state constitutional consensus in favor of gun rights at the actual moment when the 14th Amendment was adopted. Third, a substantive due process. Ryan Williams has given a long account of the history of the idea in the years before the Civil War, and he argues that the concept was well established in many states before 1868. However, he relies quite heavily on southern states to make this case. North and South Carolina were the early leaders in this tradition, and northern states were the ones most clearly opposed to it. And as I say, lots more application stuff that I need to dig into in the sequel. But thank you.